Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to be doing the first weekly meta breakdown of Phyrexia All is One. This particular video will be for standard best of one. We've covered some best of three decks for the metagame challenge up on the channel already if you're looking for standard best of three decks. But for those of you who are unfamiliar with this, what we do is every week we look at the top performing decks on the MTG Arena ladder from win rate percentages. We look across all the various formats, provided the data is available. And speaking of the data, we get this data from Untapped.gg, what you see on the screen, a companion tool that runs alongside your Arena client, tracks win rates, loss rates, deck collections, lets you know what decks you can build, has a whole bunch of cool in-game overlays, some draft help stuff. So a whole bunch of cool stuff. Definitely check that out. Link is in the video description. You can get started for free on a whole bunch of it. But we will jump into it. And we are going to be looking February 7th through the 10th. So these are the first few days. And this is going to give us a basis of what people are trying out in the first couple days, give you some ideas maybe to take into the weekend and the first week. Now, prefacing this, the meta is still very new. There's no definitive decks. A lot of the existing standard decks are still performing fairly well. I'm not going to cover those. We're just going to be focusing on net new things people are trying. And in this particular video, I'm actually going to cover the good and the bad. Usually what you do is like 55% or higher win rates. We focus on those decks. But for today, I'm going to include a bunch of decks that people were maybe hyped about that aren't doing as well. You're looking at Phyrexian, Obliterator Fight Club, or Simic Toxic, perhaps. We'll get to it. So if you have soldiers, if you have mono white aggro, if you have the mono red burn deck, those decks are all still, at least for the first couple days, above 60%. So you can still jam those to relative success. But we're going to look at what is working out of the new cards, what is not, and then kind of build it from there. I'll also do another one of these probably Monday or Tuesday. Have it out, so in quite short succession, because we'll have a bigger sample size across the weekend with people finally getting a chance to play a lot of the new cards and getting us a bigger sample size. In terms of sample size, we have 110,000 games played, platinum to mythic rank. So we're going to dive into it, but quick favor if you can ask, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, I don't know what you're doing, but just click that subscribe button. It is free and easy way to help out the channel. I have a goal of trying to hit 10,000 subs by June. It would be a nice birthday gift to me. So appreciate if you can drop that. We're in the mid 7,000s right now, so nice little push. But jumping into it, Gruul Aggro of the new cards, kind of new decks, it is the highest win rate, notwithstanding existing decks. So 58% win rate, 150 games. What do we get new from the set? Well, we get Evolving Adaptive. So this is kind of the Pelt Collector, Experimental Ooze, or whatever the one was, the old human that got evolved. So Evolving Adaptive is a 1 mana 0/0 that enters the battlefield with an oil counter. And it gets +1/1 for each oil counter on it. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if that creature has greater power or toughness, then Evolving Adaptive, you put an oil counter on it. So this is a 1-drop, and another real, like, these aggressive decks need a good density of 1-drops and 2-drops, and this allows the deck to have that. So it's a card that you play out on 1, it's a 1/1, and then every subsequent creature you cast allows it to ideally get bigger in terms of curve. So you can get this to be a 3/3, a 4/4 kind of in terms of your deck. You're pairing that with Ascendant Pack Leader, which is a very similar idea. It rewards you for playing 4-drops, and while we don't have a huge density in this deck with only the Thundering Raijus, it is still like a 1 mana 2/1 with this good rate. You can put counters on things with Kumano. You have a burn package of Play with Fire and Kami's Flare. Kami's Flare lets you deal damage to a creature, and we have a lot of ways to modify our creatures. Notably, the oil counter on the Evolving Adaptive is a modification, so it does work. So that allows you to deal some additional damage. You have Shivan Devastator as more of a kind of mid to late game ideal threat that you could push through some damage. You have Feldon for some card advantage. You have Quirion Beastcaller, another card that gets bigger with the subsequent creatures that you cast, and then it lets you redistribute those counters once it dies. We've got a couple new cards as well in here. So we have the Bloated Contaminator. 3 mana, 4/4 Trample. So base stats alone, good value. 4/4 with Trample, Trample being a key word here. The 4 toughness gets around abrades, lightning strikes, cut downs, stuff like that, which are all relevant in terms of the meta of what you're usually running into in terms of removal. So you have Toxic, which will allow you to deal poison counters. If your opponent has 10 poison counters, they lose the game. You're likely not going to win with this deck with poison counters. You'll probably deal with damage. So that's kind of negligible. But whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you get to proliferate, which means for any permanent that you have that has a counter on it, you can choose to add an additional counter. So your Beast Callers, your Ascendant Pack Leaders, your Evolving Adaptives, whatever you put the counters on with Kumano, the Shivan Devastator, all that kind of plays into effect. A cool thing with Untap, like I was mentioning, if you see, I'm missing 2 to the 4 Bloated Contaminators in one of the next card we're going to be touching base. So if I want to build this deck, I would need 7 rares. So kind of a cool idea, or like snapshot. I could see I have 59 rares, so if I want to, I can craft this deck and play right away. We then have Miglaw's Maze Crusher, 3 mana, 4/4. Again, 4/4 being a relevant kind of power toughness with a lot of the removal. So another card that enters the battlefield with oil counters on it. You can choose to remove an oil counter for 1 mana. It gains Vigilance and Menace till end of turn. Menace allowing you to kind of go around potential blockers. You can remove 2 counters from it. It gets +2/2. And then you can remove 3 counters and it destroys an artifact or enchantment. So it allows you to do some funky combat. If your opponent tries to like burn it or double block it, you can kind of get it with the extra pump there. Artifact enchantment removals, super relevant in the format. There's a lot of incidental things there, whether it be Reflection of Kiki, stuff like that. Lastly, like the Raiju, you put counters, a bunch of your stuff is modified, so you get to deal alternate damage. A big thing for this deck that might go under the radar is Copperline Gorge. This is another dual land that comes into play untapped on turns 1, 2, or 3, which is super relevant because the thing is with Rockfall Vale, it's only good on turn 3 onwards, but you see like where the curve of this deck is. You really want untapped land on 1 and 2, and that allows you to have like the 8 duels that come into play and just fixes the mana overall with a deck like this. We then go to, so we have 2 control decks next. So we'll kind of go over some of the similarities and then what the differences are. So this is Azorius control. There will be an Esper control. These are kind of Planeswalker focused decks. So the new cards in this are Jace the Perfected Mind, 2 blue Phyrexia mana. So Phyrexia mana could be either paid with a blue mana in this case, or 2 life. So it allows you to pay kind of the alternate cost. And if you do pay the alternate cost, it enters with 3 loyalty instead of 5. The plus on Jace just kind of fogs a creature, kind of slows it down by giving it -3 power. The -2, target player mills 3 cards. Then if a graveyard has 20 or more cards in it, you draw 3 cards. Otherwise, you draw a card. And then its -X is target player mills 3 times X. So you're kind of building towards that mill win condition with the Jaces while kind of slowing down your opponent's blockers. You have Teferis in here, you have Wandering Emperor as a 4 of, and then you have the Eternal Wanderer. So the kind of next version of the Wandering Emperor. Static text of no more than 1 creature can attack the Eternal Wanderer each combat. If you have it with Jace, you could kind of control how attackers are being done. You can use the plus to bounce an artifact or creature you control, return it to the battlefield at the beginning of the controller's next step. Notably, you can do this on your opponent's things too. So if you need to reset something, say something's built a lot of counters, you get like in the first deck, you can reset them that way there. You can make for 0 just 2/2 white samurai tokens with double strike. And then -4 is basically you choose one of your opponent's creatures, they sacrifice all the rest, so you leave them with the worst of their creature options. You have Experimental Augury in this deck. 2 mana, basically anticipate, look at the top 3, put 1 into your hand. But the key word in this card is Proliferate, where you can choose again any of the counters, any of the type counters on your creatures or permanents or planeswalkers in this deck, and then just put another one on. So it could kind of get you closer to ultimates in that regard. You also have Bankbuster with Proliferate, works kind of cool because you're removing counters from it, but you can proliferate counters back on, so you get extra card draw in there. The rest of the deck is basically interaction. You have Sweepers and Depopulate, Farewell. Faithful Absence, March, Laydown, kind of all mixed in there in terms of removal. Some card advantage and Memory Deluge. You have some counters, Make the Spirit Negate, and a Silver Scrutiny. Another deck that gets an additional dual land in Sea Chrome Coast. And then kind of hidden away here is Murex. So this is a win condition land. So when it enters the battlefield, you get to add any color of mana for that turn. Otherwise, it's a colorless land. And for 3 mana, you get to create a Phyrexian Might with Toxic. So you're going to kind of try to win with Toxic with this, or just have attackers. Notably, these creatures cannot block. So it's not like Castle Ardenvale, where you got the blockers in that regard. We then go to Esper Control. A lot of similarities with this. We're shaving down some of those other cards. No Jaces in this list. You have an extra Teferi. You're playing 2 Vraska's Betrayal Sting, another card with Phyrexian mana. So the 0 ability, you draw a card, lose a life, and proliferate. So this is an enabler to proliferate, so it lets you put counters on all your other planeswalkers. You get to turn any creature into a treasure. Loses all its abilities, so a good way of dealing with indestructible, anything like that. If a target player has fewer than 9 poison counters, they get that number. Basically, you put them to 9 poison, and then the next turn you can untap with Vraska, proliferate, win. You're also playing Kaya, Intangible Slayer, just a very expensive planeswalker, but it does have hexproof. I don't know how I feel about this. Sorry, this one's at 57. These decks are like 57.8, 57.1%, so it's not a huge difference. +2, each opponent loses 2 life, you gain 3 life. Sorry, they lose 3, you gain 3. 0, draw 2 cards, then each opponent may scry. And then -3, you get to exile target each creature enchantment. If it wasn't an aura, create a token that's a copy, except it's a 1/1 spirit with flying. So you get basically a copy of your opponent's stuff, ideally. Farewells, depopulates, and then the card advantage. With black, you're basically just getting hard removal and cut down. Go for the Throat and Infernal Grasp. There's a number of useful kind of removal spells. There's the Shieldred's Edict effect. There's Drown and Ichor. There's a few other removal spells that I would probably play over the Infernal Grasps. You really want to keep your life total high, so I wouldn't play this. We then go to Selesnya Toxic, 57% win rate. And this deck here is looking to poison out your opponent, and there's a number of cards here. So you obviously have the Venerated Rot Priest, which we got really hyped up in the Ivy Simic deck, where you target your stuff and you give them a bunch of poison counters. In this deck here, it's more of a less all-in, let's target, and just a bunch of creatures that are useful, and then just incidentally get poisoned at certain points. You have the Crawling Chorus, 1 mana, 1/1, Toxic 1. When it dies, you create a 1/1 Phyrexian Might with Toxic, so it kind of just replaces itself. You have Skrelv, which is the Mother of Ruin style card. It's just a little Phyrexian Might, just not nibbling on that hand. 1 mana, 1/1 Toxic, can't block, and for a Phyrexian White, another target creature you control gains Toxic 1 and Hexproof from color. So basically you get protection, or you can give something unblockable to get through those last points of toxic damage. 4 Homestead Courage, put counters on things, works nice with the Venerated Rot Priest. You have Jawbone Duelist, another card that if you put the counters on, being a double striker is quite nice. Skrelv's Hive. This is a card that lets you keep getting more and more tokens every turn, good against the grindier matchups. And then once your opponent's been corrupted by poison, all your cards with Toxic, in this case every creature in the deck, get lifelink. So it helps you swing the race as well. There's Slaughter Singer, which is a unique kind of way of having a Lord effect. Typically Lord effects are static, but with the Slaughter Singer, it's whenever another creature you control attacks, if it has Toxic, it gets +1/1 till end of turn. This also has Toxic too. Annex Sentry is kind of the creature removal, Brutal Cathar, Skyclave Apparition. You get to exile a creature an opponent controls with mana value 3 or less. And then we have the Bloated Contaminator again. In this deck, the Toxic text makes a lot more difference. And then you also get to proliferate there. A Johnny, card advantage, counters, and an emblem that allows you to put poison counters when you cast more creatures. This is another deck that benefits from the dual land. We also have Seed Core, which is allows us to another untapped duel. In this case, all the creatures are Phyrexian, so it allows us to basically spend any mana to cast them. so it helps with our curve. And then it has the corrupted ability that you can make a 1/1 creature you control get +2/1 till end of turn. This is a deck that I've also seen Arnie Hersham, I can't say his last name. The Mirex is also a card to consider, just in terms of the grindier games, to be able to play those. We then go to Mono Black Control, 54% win rate, and this deck is really just introducing Phyrexian Obliterator as well as Phyrexian Arena into the deck. It's largely the same deck that we've seen. This is one of the other removal spells I was mentioning, the Drown and Ichor. I really don't like Sorin in these types of decks right now because your curve is so high, so you're taking a lot of damage. They could be reasonable with just making like the vampire tokens to kind of offset the Phyrexian Arena damage, but largely I think you could probably forego on this. Even for Liliana's, when your curve is so high, seems kind of rough. I don't like this configuration is basically what I'm alluding to. I've seen like some Golgari versions that play Glissa that allows you to destroy one of your own permanents. Destroy an enchantment on combat damage. This is a nice way of getting your advantage of Phyrexian Arena and then destroying it when you're kind of at a lower life. It does play nicely with Sheoldred. You take a life to gain 2 life, but I feel like if you're getting this engine going, you're probably far ahead enough as is. We then go to, we have 2 versions of mono white mid-rangey style decks. This version here is going to be using Mondric Glory Dominus. 4 mana, 4/4. Basically, if you make a token, it's doubling season on a creature. And then for 1 and 2 Phyrexian white, you sacrifice 2 other artifacts or creatures, put an indestructible counter on Mondric Glory Dominus. And this is a counter not till end of turn, which is super relevant. You also have 3 Elesh Norns in this deck. 5 mana, 4/7 Vigilance. Basically, it prevents your opponents enter the battlefield with triggers, and it doubles yours. So a lot of value there. So what are we doing with enter the battlefield triggers? Restoration of Ajanjo, Lauren, Ambitious Farmhand, Ossification, Spirited Companion, all kind of come to mind. The Sanctuary Warden. So you have kind of finding your lands with the cards here. You have removal and lay down arms and ossification. Ossification is really interesting as well because it can hit planeswalkers. This is usually not an effect we see for 2 mana. You have your bank busters for card advantage. And then you also have White Sun's Twilight, not Zenith. Keep mixing those series up. But 2 white and an X, you gain X life, create X/1/1 colorless Phyrexian Might artifacts. X is 5 or more, destroy all other creatures. So you kind of a one-side, like board wipe, but you get left with 5 toxic creatures. You have your Plains, Roadside Reliquary, and Ajanjos in there. Then we have this other version. They're calling it Mono White Control, but it's kind of similar elements. Your farm hands, your Ajanjos. You're basically swapping out the Elesh Norn and Mondrak for Phyrexian Vindicator. So 4 mana, 5/5. Basically, if it was dealt damage, you prevent that damage and you get to redirect it. So mono red cries, like the Gruul deck cries, and you kind of just smash face. It's also just a 5/5 flyer for 4, which is pretty big value. You have some Elspeth in here, Sanctuary Wardens, Emperors. This version's got Depopulate, a couple Destroy Evils in there, but a lot of the core of the deck is the same in that regard. The win rate percentage, 1.2% difference, so largely similar. We then go to a couple decks that aren't doing as well. Now, I'm going to preface, so this is Croaky's version of Jund. This is more of a best of 3 deck. In best of 1, the meta is very aggressive, where this deck was built in with the mindset of a best of 3 meta, which tends to be a little bit grindier, slower, and that's usually where you see these. Like, it was the same last season a lot of times with Grixis midrange, which had like a times 75% win rate in standard best of 3, but was always in like the mid-50s for the most part in best of 1. There are ways you can edit this deck to be better in best of 1. It's things like just lowering the curve in terms of removal. Like if you look at this version here, your only interaction early is cut downs, and in a field that's fairly aggressive, it's not that great. So cutting down, like moving the Unleash Inferno to something like, oh, brain fart. Go for the Throat. Just kind of helps the deck. But the big kind of interaction here is you have Tyvar, Jubilant Brawler. 3 mana, 3/3. It gives your creatures with activated abilities, they can basically activate them without, as though they had haste. So things like Bloodtithe Harvester, you get to activate Kiki the turn it comes down. And this also helps you mill to find copies of your Bloodtithe Harvester or Vindictive Flamestoker for card advantage. Gix Command is a fairly decent removal spell and like Sweeper in the format. So it is something that is totally reasonable to just kind of sweep your opponent's board against like Wizards, Mono Red. The lifelink could be relevant as well. You have Glissa, which it just is a nightmare in combat to deal with. Gets you card advantage, destroys enchantments, and you can remove counters. I would also probably trim down the number of Bankbusters in best of one. Unless you're a dedicated control deck, you're usually not going to have time to play and activate. So I'd probably trim down 2 of these, trim 4 of these, play 2 Shieldred, play 4, go for the Throats. And that should kind of hedge your deck as well, to kind of play a little bit more of a fair game. When I was watching Croaky's stream, he was like 15-5 up towards Mythic with this deck. So in best of 3. So I did post on the other video if you want to see the sideboard and everything like that. Probably the most hyped up deck is Simic Toxic. So the core of the deck is Venerated Rot Priest and Ivy Gleeful Spell Thief. This deck's at 47% win rate. And basically, if you were to target a spell that targets only a single creature other than Ivy, you get to copy it. So by doing so, you're basically getting 2 triggers. And then the deck's just a bunch of protection style spells or auras to kind of give you card advantage. So you have Security Bypass that lets you connive, draw discard. You have Combat Research for card advantage. Audacity gives you a bonus in terms of power, as well as when it dies, you get to draw a card. You have Protection in Safekeeping and Tyvar's Stand. Infectious Bite deals damage equal to, basically you get to deal your damage as though you had, or instead of fighting, it's just deal damage. And then it gets a poison counter. So just kind of some value like that. You have your Bloated Contaminator, Storm Chaser Drake draws cards every time you target it. So some value there. A Murex hanging out in the mana base. Mono Red Aggro. So this one's more Mono Red mid-range. And this is another deck for Croakies. Another deck that looked better in best of 3 than it did best of 1. And it's given just the kind of allocation in terms of how the spells line up. And I think you can make this better in best of 1. You just kind of want to tweak. I would honestly just cut the Chandras and then cut maybe an Vindictive Flamespeaker, go up the 4th Lightning Strike, and then 2 Brotherhood's End, and you're probably good there. But the deck's built around Koth, Fire of Resistance, lets you search for mountains, and then is a main board answer to things like Shieldred, just dealing damage to target creature equal to the number of mountains you control. It gets a lot of power, which plays pretty well, and then its emblem is whenever a mountain enters a battlefield, you get to deal 4 damage to something. So you can actually, like, you +2 it, it goes to 6 loyalty. If they can't deal damage to it, with Volt Charge, you get to proliferate, so you can put it to 7 the next turn. So within like 2 turns of having this on the battlefield, you can ultimate it right away, which is really cool. You also have the Sardian Cliff Stomper in here, 2 mana, 0/4, where if you have 4 or more mountains, it gets +X, where X is the number of mountains you control. Good early blocker that late game could become a scalable win condition that just hits really hard. Outside of the deck, you just got a bunch of burn in here, some Jayas, Chandras, Fable, copy some stuff, Bloodthirsty Adversary to flash back your burn spells as well. And then lastly, 45% Fight Club. This is the Golgari Phyrexian Obliterator, try to fight things. So the core of the deck is you have Phyrexian Obliterator out, and you play fight spells. Bushwhack. Actually, this version's only playing Bushwhack. I've seen some versions go up to 8. This is a little bit disjointed, which is probably contributing, but this was the one that had the highest win rate. So it's kind of a Invoke Despair deck that's also jamming fight spells and just kind of all over the place. You have a Tyvlar in here, Glissa. You have a bunch of ramp, which is kind of nice. That gets you out your Obliterator earlier. So you could go turn 3 Obliterator, turn 4 Invoke Despair, which plays pretty nice, all things considered. I'd cut this Sword. It's not really doing anything for you. You have things like the Edict. The One of Duress doesn't really make much sense. Play 2, 3, or don't play any. Cruelty of Gix can come out. This card's not really reasonable right now, but cut the Sword, cut this, play 4 cut downs, play a couple more Go for the Throats, maybe another Glissa, and then you'll have a more reasonable deck there. I don't mind Gix Command because it does work really well against like Soldiers decks, stuff like that. The lifelink, rebuying your creatures has a lot of utility. Vraska and Flesh Gorgers are reasonable inclusions as well in here. Kind of mixed into there. This is a deck that did not get a dual land. That was part of the other standard set, Shadows over Innistrad, so instead they're playing the Trio. So that's pretty much it for the week. It's a bit of a longer one. Like I said, I wanted to cover decks that were doing well and decks that weren't. So this allows you to see and kind of shape your perspective in terms of what your meta is. Again, if you're keeping in mind like Soldiers, Mono White Aggro, Soldiers, Esper Legends, Mono White Soldiers, Mono White Soldiers, Mono Black Control, Mono Red Aggro, Mono Red Burn, Selesnya Enchantments. These are all decks that existed, the Mono Blue deck, that are still putting up reasonable results to kind of play with that. But that is it for the week, or at least for now. Let me know what you've been playing, what you've been enjoying, and we'll catch you next time.